Alright, so this is the base neck when I last left it. The scarf joint here has been cut and glued together. It's still pretty rough looking, but it's holding for now. So my goal for today is to get through the cleaning up the scarf joint, thinning the peg head to the correct thickness, and hopefully adding the heel block. And probably in a third video I'll show you carving the neck and shaping it and carving the heel and all that, because there's a lot involved in it, and I know a lot of people are actually worried about it if you get into instrument building. That's one of the steps that people don't really like. So first on this, what you have to do is thin the headstock down, and there's a couple of ways to go about this. If you thin the face of it, what that happens actually is, as you thin it, I'll show you with my ruler, the face of the peg head slowly creeps back, and it's kind of hard to see, but the peg head here, it intersects the neck farther and farther towards the heel, which means your neck gets shorter and shorter as you go. Or you can choose to thin the back of the peg head, which won't move this line here, the back of the nut. It will instead just thin this part out. It'll essentially just be carving away right there somewhere. So that's what I'm going to do, just because my neck blank is a little bit short, and the heel on the base is going to have to be pretty thick to match the old one. I have the old neck with me to check the peg head thickness. As you can see, I got it there, and that's how thick the heel has to be. So let's mark it out and figure out what we got to do. Alright, so I actually lied a little bit, sorry about that. Forgot what you have to do is you actually, before you start thinning out the peg head, like I said in the previous clip, it's a little rough. If you can look closely, you can see that it's overhanging just on the front here a little bit, and that has to be cleaned up before you thickness the back, because then if you thin the back too far and then thin the front to make it all smooth, you might end up with a peg head that's too thin, and if that's the case, under string tension it could actually just snap right off. So we're gonna actually thin the peg head here. One second. Just gotta clamp the workpiece down to the table. It's always good to make sure it's clamped tightly so it's not going anywhere, and you don't have to worry about the piece sliding around as you're trying to work with it. Alright, so what you're gonna want your pencil for helping clean up the front. And let's see, where did I put that? It should be a square gauge. You should have a square gauge too, like a engineering square, or just one of these triangle squares works well too. They're not exactly 90 degrees, these aren't, but they're close enough. By the time you get the peg head all shaped and stuff, the nut's actually just going to be thin enough that like 1 degree or half a degree off is going to be okay. So you're going to want to square a line with the side of the neck close to where the peg head starts, where the slant starts. Make sure to draw the line nice and thick, and as you can see there's, or I don't know if you can if the light's too bright, but there's a line right here. I'll make it a little bit darker just so you can see it. Alright, so now with that square line there, you know you don't want to plane past that. So when you grab your plane, you want to slide it down the neck down the peg head to thin it out some. But you don't want the plane's blade here to bite anything past this line, because then the peg head gets too thin. I'm just gonna clean that up and probably fast forward this part because it might take a while. Alright, so I finished thinning out the peg head here. or at least smoothing the front. I mean, not thinning it. But, oops. With this scarf joint here, one good way you can tell if you're keeping the peg head completely level, not like twisting it or anything as you go down, the front face of the joint right here, that line right there, if you take your square, line it up against that line and look down it, you can see if it's not completely square, like I'll draw a line to show you guys. You can see as the line goes across, if the face of the peg head here, if that is not completely square, you'll see the line here doesn't stay straight with this joint, with the front of the joint. It'll move a little bit, so you can thin the peg head a little bit more, thin the high areas, and leave the low areas, and see what you got. You can also check the peg head face by taking your straight edge here and putting it on an angle, putting the edge here on an angle on the face, and looking down it, and if you see any light underneath it, you know that that's a gap underneath it and the board's not completely flat. But this is good for the work. Now we have to thin the back of the peg head down to the correct thickness. And I have the other neck with me, the first bass guitar neck that I'm patterning here with me. So you just gotta measure the thickness. Now you see the faceplate there, the black and white part on the side of the peg head. That's called the head plate. You don't want to include that in your thickness. You just want to include the wood of the actual headstock here and how thick you want the peg head there, because you'll be gluing another veneer on the face, so you don't want to include that veneer and then glue another veneer on top. It'll make it too thick for your tuners. Alright, so it's coming in. You want to measure on a couple of points just to make sure you got correct thickness. Looks like it's about 1/2 inch is what I want. So you just lay the peg head on its side here, and let's see, you can take your square again and just faintly draw a line square with the front of the peg head, just so that way you know if you're measuring, your ruler's going to stay straight, and if it tilts, it won't tilt on an angle and measure shorter. Because if you're drawing a circle, if you go farther left or right on the circle, it turns out not to be the same length straight out. Alright, so you draw a couple lines, measure from the front of the peg head, and make 2 marks. And then you take your ruler here, line up those 2 marks, and connect the dots. I found 2 marks, for me at least, works well. 3 usually just seems to confuse me, and nothing seems to actually stay straight at that point. You're just kind of guessing in between them all. Alright, like I said, you draw a line there. There is another way to do it, actually. I'll show you with this side. What you can do is, if you have a circle marking gauge, I think it's called, I forget the actual name, you can actually set this to the appropriate depth. Just measure how far down you want from the base here to the blade. Coming in at 1/2 inch, I already measured that. And you can actually just take that, place the face plate here parallel with the peg head, and press the blade in and run it down the side. And that'll give you 1/2 inch all the way down, completely parallel to the face here. Then just take a pencil, run it along the gouged out part just to make it a little more visible. And there you go. Now have it completely marked on both sides, how deep you want to cut the away on the peg head. And you'll want to mark it on both sides, just because if you do it only one, you can end up a little thicker on one side or a little thinner, and then it just looks lopsided and it's a little weaker. Alright, so I'm going to cut this out. I'm actually going to use a bandsaw, but I don't have any place to set up the camera over there, so I'm going to do that off screen. You just line up the lines with your blade and run it through slowly, and everything should work out. Alright, I'll meet you when that's done. Alright, welcome back. I got the peg head thinned down on the bandsaw. pretty happy with it. It's pretty close to the lines except for one spot right here. It's a little hard to see, but it's just a little bubble out. So there's some ways you can deal with that. You can either thin it with a hand plane like you did the front. You can use a chisel. You can use sanders, rasp, just anything that'll kind of smooth that out. I'm actually just going to use a quick sander on it. Bring it all back down to level. Gotta put in my earplugs here. Trust me, working with loud tools all day and all night can really do a number on your hearing. And make sure your work surface is clear. Alright. So you just set the sander flat. Alright, got that little rough patch all taken care of. You can take your square again and check it against the sides to see if it is completely square. Mine's not fully, but I'm going to address that actually after I start cutting out the peghead and getting that all shaped out, because then it'll be a little narrower and a little easier to deal with. Alright, the next step you're going to want to do is figure out your scale length on your neck and how much you're going to actually cut off here to use for the heel. So like I said in my first video, the neck on the old one was for 34-inch scale length from the nut here to the bridge, excuse me. Oh goodness. But I want to shorten that, so I can't use the length of this neck because I'll just end up right back where I was. So, having done a little bit of research, there is not too much of a consensus. People tend to like basses about 30 to 34 inches, roughly. But those I found tend to be electric basses, and those are a little bit different than acoustics because there's a lot more hardware holding it all together, and you're not actually worried about the resonance as much as you are the pickups and all that. So for this, I'm going to try and shoot for, let's say, a 28-inch scale length, which means I know that, like I said, the old one was 34 inches, but that doesn't account for the actual length on the body. It only counts for how long the neck is. So what you have to do is measure the old neck, if you don't know how long it is, from the actual heel to the body, or heel to the bridge, which I do, but just for story's sake, I'm going to measure from the nut down to the heel of the bass, the neck here. That comes in at 20 inches, which 20 from 34 means 14 inches are left over the body that the strings have to go from the heel here to that's loud, from the heel to the body. So from this point right here on is 14 inches. So if I'm going to shoot for a 28-inch scale length, that means I have to subtract 14 from the 28 because the 14 from the heel to the bridge does not change. So 14 from 28 leaves another 14. If I did my math right, yeah I did. So what you want to do is actually square your line here again if you happen to lose it from smoothing out the front of the peghead. And one step I've forgotten before, but you want to make sure to do this, is you actually want to take about 1/4 of an inch or so extra from that line and square that, because that's actually going to be your nut. Right here. And if you don't include that space, then the nut has nowhere to sit, and the peghead here, the slanted part, actually just butts right up against the beginning of the fretboard, and there's nothing to guide the strings over it, and your neck's too short, and you gotta start over. So make sure to always, always, always include the thickness of the nut. I like 1/4 inch for the bass just because the strings are fatter, and it gives it a little more meat to hold on to. So, going from the previous number, I threw out 14 inches on the neck. That comes in right down here. But there's one thing that I want to do actually with this bass neck, And I'm actually going to thin it just a little bit up here and leave it full thickness down here. And the reason for that is it makes it a little bit more playable. You lose a little bit of strength doing that, but makes it a little more playable, a little easier to get your hand around. And two, just a little bit of an angle on the front here. I'll try and demonstrate. If you angle it just a little bit, where the face of the neck here meets the peg head, that line actually moves back farther and farther, and that gives you just a little bit more fretboard to play with. And it also means that the nut is actually going to be sitting right over this line where the peg head starts, the scarf joint starts, which, I mean, it looks appealing. It's a little bit stronger and it's a little easier to work with. At least I think so. I could be wrong, I don't know. But the way that I'm going to do that is I have a joiner planer that I'm going to use to thin it out just a little bit. First though, I want to measure how deep I want to take this. On the previous neck here, just kind of rough measuring, I can see that it came in at about, let's see, 5/8 of an inch or so deep. And this board I know is 3/4 of an inch, so put it all together, you got to take off 1/8 of an inch here to match the old neck, which I think I'll do. Let's see, take off just 1/8. You want to mark near as far back towards the scarf joint here, towards the glue joint, as you can, just so that way you have an accurate measurement and everything stays the same. And make sure to mark it on both sides, because otherwise your neck can end up off square just a little bit, and then you have to worry about later down the road the strings are sitting higher off one side than they are the other because your neck's twisted and nothing's lining up, and trust me, it's a big pain. Alright, just like the bandsaw, unfortunately I don't have any place to set up the camera, so I'm gonna do that off camera and come back when it's all done. See you then. Actually, just before I do that, before I thin it, one last thing I wanted to mention, just to show you guys that thinning this part of the fretboard, or this part of the neck, but leaving this back end a little thicker, does in fact lengthen it just a little bit. I'm going to draw a line square on the edge, or square on the neck, in line with the back of the nut, that line right there. So that way you can see later, once I'm done thinning it, that even just taking off a little bit does in fact make a big difference. So you can see there's the line on the side of the neck, and there. Alright, now I'm going to go thin it.